Welcome to the Paradise Paradox. So today we're talking about Syria, the situation in Syria, particularly focusing on the Islamic State or ISIS. So there tends to be this conception among a lot of people that ISIS is actually controlled by the US government, either by the CIA or some other military agency or intelligence agency. And as our guest, Ishmam Ahmed, has found out through his many months of research on the subject, that's entirely false. ISIS actually receives no support whatever from the US government. And so Ishmam is going to present the case and show us how that came about, how ISIS came about from Al-Qaeda Iraq, and also the present state of the Assad regime, which influences that area, and also about the present state of the Islamic State as a de facto government in that area. And we'll also talk about some other groups in the area, such as the Free Syria Army, which is hopefully working for peace and freedom from Assad and freedom from ISIS for people in the area. So let's get into it. So I'm here with my buddy Ishmam Ahmed, and he's been following the situation in Syria with ISIS for a while and researching a lot of articles. Now, there's this perception that the US arms the Islamic State, or they arm ISIS, and all of your research indicates that this perception is entirely false. Is that accurate?
Yep, that is quite accurate indeed.
How did ISIS come to exist in its present form?
All right, so you have to go all the way back to the US invasion of Iraq when the organization called Al-Qaeda in Iraq arose. And that's how it started originally. And from there on in, due to changes in personnel, due to changes in the struggles of that organization, it came to mutate until the opportunities of the Syrian civil war gave it opportunity to expand. A new base from which to finally establish a dictatorship, essentially.
So what was it about the changing situation which gave them the opportunity to expand?
All right, so because you see, like, by around 2010, IS was pretty much on the back foot, or it was called ISI back then. It was on the back foot. They were underground pretty much. But then the Syrian civil war, it weakened the monopoly of power in eastern Syria, and that gave opportunity for IS to move from Iraq and expand into Syria. And from there, it gave them a stable base in which to organize their plots, pretty much.
What was the political climate when Al-Qaeda Iraq started? What were the political factors which gave rise to them?
All right. So in the context of US occupation, it was disproportionately targeted against Arab Sunnis in Iraq. And besides just the US military, there was also the Iraqi government, or the Iraqi puppet governments, who were led by sectarian Shiite politicians who were who were more interested in, revanchist policies against Sunni Arabs rather than working towards, genuine democracy.
Why were people so prejudiced or out for vengeance against the Sunni Arabs?
It's this tendency towards collective guilt, pretty much, which too many statists have, pretty much. Instead of recognizing that it was a ruling class that should be blamed for their atrocities, they end up blaming whatever demographic group the ruling class comes from. So in this case, Saddam Hussein, he was a Sunni Arab, and his fellow elites were disproportionately Sunni Arabs.
Years later, they were still blaming Sunni Arabs for what Saddam Hussein had done.
Pretty much.
The transformation from Al-Qaeda Iraq to to the Islamic State. Is it the same organization with a different name, or is it really something distinct?
Well, I guess you can say it pretty much just a change in name, but I guess it's worth pointing out why they decided to make these changes in their names. So one of them is to emphasize the fact that they really did operate independently of bin Laden's original parent organization. That's one reason, and pretty much to emphasize the fact that their focus or their base was in Iraq. So that's why they changed from Al-Qaeda to ISI, or Islamic State in Iraq.
So they were deliberately separating themselves from the parent organization.
Yeah.
And saying, yeah, we're something distinct and something different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But in terms of the structure of the organization, it's quite similar.
All right. So I guess one difference worth noting is that the organization assimilated or hired many Ba'athist officers who served under Saddam Hussein and hired them as military strategists amongst the leadership. So yeah, that's also worth noting for ISI.
So sorry, what's Ba'athist is a racial group or?
No, the Ba'ath it refers to the Ba'ath party that Saddam Hussein ran.
So they decided to recruit what were once their enemies.
Formerly under Saddam Hussein, they had contempt for Al-Qaeda pretty much, and these Islamist types. But I guess when you're dealing with the U.S. occupation, former foes can come together against their common enemy, the U.S.
In our conversations before, you mentioned that when Al-Qaeda Iraq had to decided to cut its ties from Al-Qaeda, then they had reduced support, and then they supported themselves through organized crime. Can you tell us a bit about that?
All right. So some examples of organized criminal activity they engaged in order to survive their low period included protection rackets, kidnapping for ransom, and fencing off stolen goods or chop shop operations, those sort of activities essentially.
What about narcotics? They didn't really deal in narcotics?
I have to look that up. I'm pretty sure they would have done to some extent, and I'm pretty sure they would have got some, ridiculous justification, religious justification, or at least, why it's okay for them to do it, but not others. But yeah. But otherwise, those activities I mentioned tend to be the biggest contributors.
So it makes me think about the situation in Colombia where you have these paramilitaries and guerrilla groups. They started off with something of a noble goal, like they were fighting for the liberation. A lot of the times it was like farmers who became radicalized because their land was stolen by the state or something like that. But over time, they started to intimidate farmers themselves and tell them, you're going to grow cocaine for us or this type of thing. So they became criminals after time. Do you think that situation is comparable?
I guess somewhat, but you have to, I guess, differentiate between the original leaders of the organization versus recruits who joined after the during the occupation. So the leadership, they always had these brutalist goals, these desire to impose their own state, or their own version of a state. But for the recruits, it was more they were victimized under the U.S. occupation, and in which case that drove them to join the group.
Okay, so you have the people at the top who are power hungry, and then down below you have the pawns who are willing to fight for them because they think some good will come of it.
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So some of the documents you sent to me indicated that there's quite widespread torture by Assad's current regime in Syria. Yep. Can you tell me a bit about that? Okay,
yeah. So, of course, Assad was always fond of torture, but it really escalated during the Arab Spring protests in Syria. So, peaceful protesters just being dragooned off into pretty much dungeons and they have to endure things like beatings, being strung up, deprivation, including sleep deprivation, in being forced to witness acts of torture themselves against other prisoners. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, naturally.
Yeah, well, I remember reading one case where the fellow was, they asked him, is anybody from this town? I think he was a nurse or something. And so he put up his hand and they said, okay, come with us. And then he found his cousin waiting in the room and they forced him to torture his own cousin.
Absolutely sadistic indeed.
What other things, other than torture, are there other terrible examples of things that the Assad regime has done?
Yeah, so shooting of peaceful protesters, that's what happened during before the armed resistance against his regime. That was one of his massive crimes. Another massive crime, ever since armed resistance broke out, was mass bombings in civilian areas. So without any regard for civilians, just disproportionate and indiscriminate bombings from the air. And it's probably the biggest killer in Syria.
Okay, that's quite terrible. So how do those acts affect radicalisation?
All right, so I guess it's worth pointing out that despite all that atrocities, most Syrian rebels have not become radicalised, but saying that, like, there will always be this minority that can easily be recruited by brutalist organizations because of those horrible experiences. So, despite the hypocrisy of IS, they also, easily use Assad's crimes as a recruiting tool.
So the perception of Assad in the West sometimes it isn't as critical as it probably should be. Say, for example, in the anti-war left, why isn't the West as critical of Assad as it should be?
All right. So wait, when you mean the West, you mean Western governments or Western anti-war activists?
Okay. So I guess it's more among anti-war activists. But if you have some thoughts on Western governments, that's interesting too. Okay,
then. So for Western anti-war activists, they tend to be driven by this thoughts about anti-imperialism, the alleged idea that Assad is a hero of anti-imperialism, a resistor of the Syrian nation against U.S. imperialism, and that's problematic in many ways. One, because it's not true. And two, because even if it was true, people have the right to resist their oppressors.
So because Assad is anti-US imperialism, that gives people the idea that he's a good guy.
Yeah.
And then they kind of give him a free pass, or they don't look at the nasty stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, and as I mentioned, it's not true anyway in the first place. So. So two examples we can point out is during 2001 to 2003, he collaborated with the CIA in their extraordinary rendition program. So the CIA would find all these suspects who on the most dubious evidence were just arrested, and then they'd be shipped over to other countries. So in this case, Syria, and their Syrian agents would just beat the hell out or torture those poor suspects. And a prominent victim of this is a guy by the name of Maher Arar. You want to do you think audience would like to know the spelling, or they can hear it fine?
We'll put it in the notes. But what happened to Arar?
So it's just the U.S. government pretty much shipped him over. I forgot whereabouts he was arrested, but it was back in 2002. And then that poor fella sent over to Syria, put into a very small cell, and would endure beatings and electrocutions for many hours a day. And it happened for quite a while. But thankfully, the Syrian agents, after all that horrible things they did, decided, yeah, he's innocent, and it's whatever, send him back to to Canada, where his home was. Yeah. Yeah, so the Syrian government, I guess, nice of them to acknowledge he was innocent, and the Canadian government as well. But the US government never acknowledged his innocence whatsoever.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or at least they never acknowledged any of their own wrongdoing.
So you described IS as currently being as a sort of dictatorship. Can you tell us a bit more what the condition is? Like before, in a conversation before, you described it as a de facto state.
Yeah.
Can you go into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah. So I guess ever since they started seizing large swathes of territory in Syria, they're establishing their own monopoly of power. They weren't tolerating the existence of the local activists. No autonomy whatsoever. They totally quashed local people's councils. When I say local council, don't confuse it with our governments. It's more like cooperative organizations. Yeah, and they totally crushed them and then totally imposed their own laws. So laws against smoking, laws against women being uncovered, all that sort of all sorts of unjust laws. And they have imposed taxes, pretty much, asset forfeiture, if you want to call it that, as well. Yeah, and conscription. It's what non-government entity can conscript tens of thousands of people?
Yep. So they are quite well established as a state.
Yeah.
So in regards to Israel, so Israel is one of the US's greatest allies in the region and probably the greatest ally in the world. Israel has its own interest in protecting itself, I assume. What is, from Israel's perspective, what is the best case scenario for what's happening there in Syria and Iraq?
Yeah, for Israel, it would just be wishing for the war to continue on and on and on, so that basically the rebels can never become a potent anti-Zionist force, and so that in the event of an Assad victory, they'll be dealing with a weaker Assad, and therefore they can have much greater influence in the Middle Eastern region.
So there must be a strong anti-Zionist sentiment that exists there.
In Syria, yeah, especially amongst the rebels. Yeah, and also, despite Assad's rhetoric, that's not where his interest is. His interest is in ruling over his own people, not in helping out the Palestinian people.
We had this tweet from the human rights activist and Arab Spring commentator Iyad al-Baghdadi, and he's got this note here: March 23rd, 2011. Regime already describes peaceful protests, referred to as a case, as a foreign conspiracy carried out by Al-Qaeda. Assad is accusing these peaceful protesters of being terrorists, basically. How common is that propaganda technique?
Yeah, it's quite common. For example, Gaddafi used that technique as well, claiming that protesters are agents of Al-Qaeda. And for example, and in Egypt, accusing all protesters of somehow being, under Mubarak, accusing protesters of being, agents of the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not terrorists, but yeah, they're defamed as terrorists in Egypt, and it's easy to just smear them as Muslim Brotherhood people.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that kind of propaganda affects the public perception in Syria and Iraq? Do most people would people buy that, or they dismiss it as the state trying to manipulate? Yeah,
I guess it varies amongst class. So if we're talking about pro-regime people, especially those who constantly watch state media, particularly from military families or amongst the politically connected, wealthy people, they tend to be the types who just happily, swallow the whole propaganda. But if you're talking about, say, lower class people who endure oppression and are especially connected to the areas that are under heavy protest, they obviously know it's baloney.
Okay. Well, I had another quote here from Baghdadi. He's written, the Syrian catastrophe was very preventable if the world's red line was killing protesters rather than drowned refugee toddlers. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So from my interpretation of like his general views, it's more like a case of the world should have been caring about what's happening from the get-go rather than like, an advocacy for military intervention. I'd say that, you don't need military intervention. You shouldn't support military intervention anyway, but the point is things could have been much better if people around the world were sympathetic, were trying to understand what's going on, and try to find ways of helping the Syrian people since 2011 rather than starting like 2015.
So there are many cases where the CIA, for example, has deliberately disrupted governments to overthrow them and try to install puppet dictators. What was the extent of the US involvement in the Arab Spring?
All right, so I'd say there are 4 different categories of how the US interacted during the Arab Spring. So, say amongst strong allies that has maintained their stranglehold on power throughout the protests, the US just maintained the status quo, just continuing delivering weapons, maintain friendly diplomatic relationships, not saying any critical words during that period. In other cases, like say amongst more wavering allies, like allies in which the dictatorship was like on shaky ground, the US government would make tepid criticisms, belated like criticisms that were too late and too little too late, pretty much. And it's also worth noting that was pretty much the case with Assad, even though Assad is not a close ally of the US, he's more a neutral dictatorship. Nevertheless, it was also the same response from the US to him. It's like belated and tepid criticisms of Assad. And another category would be where, like, so say amongst allies, like in Yemen, if the dictatorship was on weak grounds, that they would try to get the head dictator to step down to preserve the rest of the government. That was another form of strategy, pretty much. And the 4th case would be Libya. But Libya is an exceptional case in the Arab Spring because in the case of Libya, a huge portion of the military and political elite defected to the rebels. So in the case of Libya, that's why the NATO was willing to send aircraft and military aid to help out the rebels.
We had this quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, the political scientist and former counsel of U.S. presidents, and he made this statement, which many people interpreted as saying that ISIS is actually a U.S. asset, because when Russia attacked Syria, he said that they're putting at risk these U.S. assets. What assets do you think he was talking about?
Yeah, I would say that he had the FSA units in mind. Yeah, but the unfortunate fact is that he's also creating his own like another myth, or contributing to another myth, that the FSA is somehow like agents of US intervention, or that they're beneficiaries of US military aid. And it's like, yeah, it's a deplorable contribution because, like, it's totally not true.
Yeah. So the FSA doesn't receive any support from the US government.
Yeah, but it's worth wondering, like, how does this myth keep coming about? So we know that, like, there will be many American-made weapons in FSA hands. So where did it come from? Did it come from the US directly? No, but it did come from the countries Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar.
And then there is actually there is a U.S. asset in Syria, which is 100 rebels, which have been trained by the U.S. They were trained in the condition that they don't attack Assad. What role do they play? Do they have any significant role, considering they're so small in number?
Yeah, they're not really that significant because once they crossed into Syria, the Nusra Front organization, who the US is really like focused against, they pretty much subdued those rebels and forced them to hand over the weapons. So it was like they didn't have enough firepower to deal with Nusra's opposition, pretty much. So even before they could start fighting IS, like the Nusra Front, put a stop to that force.
So why were those 100 rebels told that they can't attack Assad if Assad is supposed to be against U.S. imperialism?
So you have to remember that from 2009 onwards, the U.S. and Syria were entering this sort of détente or mending ties, essentially. So you have to remember, by that point, they were no longer the hard foes that they were during the Bush years, during the Bush era. Yeah.
Like you were saying before, it's in the when it comes to Assad, the U.S. is kind of indifferent. They would rather just leave him alone and just let him do his thing.
Yeah, I'd say that is generally the case. Of course, if they're fearful that he's on shaky grounds, like his crackdown is empowering the revolution, the Syrian revolution, then they might offer some tepid criticism. It's like, oh, you're being too disproportionate. You should try being more reasonable. They might say that sort of thing, but it doesn't go beyond words, essentially.
With these rebels, like the US was there or in some capacity, and they were offering this training. If the militants or the rebels there were so keen to usurp Assad, why wouldn't they just accept the training and then leave and go off and do their own thing?
Yeah, you have to remember that this training program was heavily bureaucratized, like so much paperwork, so much layers of vetting. Like with that many layers of vetting, was like there's no way you could get even 1,000 people within like a year or 2 years to get to pass through the program. So hence, even if rebels were willing to make that sort of deal, they wouldn't have the opportunity.
Yep. So they had to go through background checks and get references from 10 relatives or something weird like that.
Yeah.
Yep. So you did say it was in the millions of dollars that they spend on this program and
yeah, I think
100
like
rebels.
So it would easily have been like $1.5 million per rebel if like on that calculation.
Right. So a lot of these articles about the situation in Syria and ISIS seem to speak very favorably of the Free Syrian Army. What are the good and bad aspects of the FSA?
So the FSA in general, like it is a genuine defender of communities against the Assad regime, as well as IS, who I prefer calling the Bashar al-Baghdadi regime, to emphasize that they're pretty much a dictatorship like Assad. Yeah, and besides protecting against these two dictatorships, they also recognize and abide by the wishes of the local councils, or which we call the local coordinating committees.
Okay. So they definitely have some respect for the law and for peace and order.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I guess if you want to be critical, like you can criticize them, say, like with issues of corruption, like that is a important issue. Although it's like their good outweighs the bad, and the bad that they do is far, far less than in, say, under Assad. Nevertheless, it is a legitimate target of criticism.
Being a Muslim, can you tell me some of the things that ISIS does which are contrary to the Quran?
Yeah, so imposing cruel and unusual punishments, like it's as a Muslim, one should emphasize restitution. One should that's what one should aim for, not like imposing cruel and unusual punishment. So, for example, chopping the hands of thieves. That is like absolutely disproportionate to the crime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but like even worse crimes under IS would be like imposing crucifixion amongst supposed traitors. That's one example, and another case would be the imposition of sex slavery amongst women from this minority religious group called the Yazidi.
How would they try to justify that from in a religious sense, or do they just do it and then, or it's, they say it's for God or something bizarre like that?
They try to find religious, like scriptural support for it, like support from the scriptures. So they might but the issue tends to be that they so we have to separate out two different categories of scripture. So there's the Quran itself, and then there is these texts called the Hadith. So it means the sayings of the Prophet. When it comes to the Hadith, the problem is they rely too often on historically unreliable portions of the Hadith. And that's it's easy to pick and choose when it comes to those unreliable texts. You can easily ignore the less brutal versions and just choose the more brutal narratives, even if there's no historical reliability to those narratives whatsoever. In the case of the Quran, the issue tends to be mistranslation and misinterpretation. So it's for example, the whole issue of cutting off the hand. It's why do you have to translate it as literally cutting off the hand? Can't you translate it as marking the hand? That's a legitimate translation or interpretation, to mark the hand or to cut off means of committing robbery.
I always have some trouble trying to figure this out in my head, because just about every Muslim that I've met is an exceptionally kind person, and so when people say that it's actually responsible for all this murder or something like that, I do have to question this contradiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that what makes IS different from an ordinary Muslim is statism. That's the key ingredient, or statism to an extreme degree.
Yep.
Designed to impose your views or your version of things upon others. Whereas other ordinary Muslims, even if they're not going to be anarchists, but nevertheless, as ordinary human beings, they realize that they realize that to some extent voluntarism is how things must be.
So when you say statism there, you mean authoritarianism, supporting a government, supporting a ruling class, one person or one group of people ruling over another. Yep. Great. So I know as a result of this interview, we might get some criticism, and we might be accused of being U.S. government agents or COINTELPRO or something like that. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah. So it's first of all, deal with the facts. It's it doesn't matter what you think I am. If the facts say that IS is not an asset of the U.S. government, then that's the fact. And I guess it's also worth pointing out. So another faction in the Syrian civil war is the PYD. They're the Kurds in the north. So they have received massive amounts of US aid. It's ask them. Do they think that their American allies or their American helpers are helping their enemies? It's you must be a fool to think that they're naive. Yeah, and I guess another thing worth pointing out is people who think that the US is helping the FSA. It's tell that to the FSA. They've been bombed quite a few times by the US government itself. Yeah.
Well, I remember reading one of those documents you sent me, and someone brought that up with an FSA member, and he was like, "Well, if only Allah would wish that."
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course. Just because you're pointing out the fact that ISIS isn't supported by the U.S. government doesn't mean in any sense that you're actually supportive of U.S. imperialism or war or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's we should reject this false dilemma, logical fallacy, pretty much.
There is a lot of nuance there, and people even I shared this meme on Facebook, and I thought, ISIS belongs to the US, and you pointed out that was false, and started to educate me on the matter. Yeah. So the thing is, the truth is not a meme, and you can't condense this complex history and this complex socio-political military situation down to just a few sentences on Facebook. It doesn't really work. There's so many factors involved there. Did you have any final notes? Anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like don't let your preconceptions or make the facts fit your theory. Rather, see what the facts are. Don't be scared of the facts. Even if it takes a while, just slowly work through it and let the facts shape your understanding of what's really going on in Syria and what's really going on in Iraq.
Great. Yeah, so we'll put a lot of articles in the show notes there, and people can look at the evidence for themselves and confirm that what you're saying is accurate. Thanks so much, Ishmam. Thanks for enlightening us on the subject.
Thank you too, Kurt.
See you, buddy.
See ya.